This week we're talking about Zacchaeus. I've come inside actually because of the noise outside, the dogs barking and the people working in egg gardens, chainsaws and strimmers going. So I gave up recording in the garden and I came into the house. It's a beautiful day outside. I'm a little bit sad I've got to be in here, but nevertheless, this is where I am. This week we are looking at Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is found in Luke chapter 19. Zacchaeus is a tax collector, and he is the very short man who climbs a tree to look at Jesus when he enters Jericho. Let's read the account that Luke writes of Zacchaeus, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was. But on account of the crowd he could not, because he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up to him and said, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all grumbled, "He's gone in to be the guest of a man who's a sinner." And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, "Behold, Lord, half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, since he is also a son of Abraham, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." There's another story which we used to use as part of a school assembly when we were talking about Zacchaeus, and that is the Roger Hargreaves stories, the Mr. Men stories, one called Mr. Wrong. And I'm going to read Mr. Wrong for you this morning. Whatever Mr. Wrong did was absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong. However hard he tried, he just couldn't do anything right. Just look at his house. One fine morning, Mr. Wrong woke up. He hadn't slept very well because of the way he'd made his bed the day before. He jumped out of bed, fell over twice, put on his shoes on the wrong feet, went to the bathroom, tripping over the bath mat, squeezed out the toothpaste on the wrong side of his toothbrush, cleaned his teeth, ouch, and went downstairs, bump, 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 bump. Not a very good start to the day. In fact, his usual wrong start to the day. In his kitchen, Mr. Wrong poured some milk onto his cornflakes and missed. And he sat in his kitchen that fine morning, eating his cornflakes, and sighed. "Oh dear," he thought, "I just do wish that everything I do wasn't quite so absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong." So after breakfast, he went for a walk in order to think how he could solve his problem. It took him 10 minutes to get outside of the house because he kept trying to open his door outwards instead of inwards. As he walked along, he passed a worm. "Good morning, dog," he said. The worm grinned. He was used to Mr. Wrong. He met a postman. "Good morning, Mr. Wrong," called the postman cheerfully. "Good morning, doctor," replied Mr. Wrong. Oh dear. He met old Mrs. Twinkle, who lived down the lane. "Good morning, Mr. Wrong," she smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Twinkle," replied Mr. Wrong. Oh dear. And then he met somebody he'd never met before. Somebody who sort of looked like him, but didn't. "Good morning, sir," said that somebody. "Good morning, madam," replied Mr. Wrong. "I'm Mr. Wrong." "I guess that," replied the person, "but I'm Mr. Right. Now tell me," he went on, "why are you walking along looking so miserable?" "Because," replied Mr. Wrong, "I can't do anything right." "In which case," said Mr. Right, "we'd better do something about that. Follow me." And off he set. And off sent Mr. Wrong. In the opposite direction. Mr. Right hurried back and turned him around. "This way," he said. And they walked together to right where Mr. Right lived. It was a house which looked something like Mr. Wrong's house, but different. Mr. Right took Mr. Wrong into his living room, I think, he said, the only way that you are ever going to change is if you come and live with me for a while. And you may end up not being quite so absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong about everything. Sit down, he said, and we'll talk about it. Mr. Wrong sat down and missed. Mr. Wrong stayed with Mr. Right for a month, and during that time he changed. After 1 week he was slightly less wrong than he'd been before. After 2 weeks he was even more slightly less wrong than he'd been before. And after full 4 weeks he was a changed Mr. Man. You could hardly tell the difference between him and Mr. Right. Don't you agree? Mr. Right was delighted. Told you, he cried. Told you that everything you might end up being not quite so absolutely, totally, completely and utterly wrong. In fact, he continued, you've really turned out all right. Mr. Wrong blushed. It was quite the nicest thing that anyone had ever said to him in the whole of his life. And he went home and lived happy and right ever after. Now that Mr. Wrong's story and the account of Jesus and Zacchaeus have some real parallels, don't they? And in fact, in the 1980s, Wendy and I were part of a joint churches schools assembly team in our first church, and we used that parallel and we used those stories to do schools assemblies with. And I want to draw on some of those parallels this morning before moving on to consider some of the other things that we might consider from the account of Zacchaeus. Mr. Wrong knew there was something wrong in his life. He said, I wish that everything I did wasn't so quite absolutely, totally, completely, utterly and completely wrong. And Zacchaeus might not have articulated it that way, but his actions show that he too thought that something was wrong in his life. And many people live with a nagging feeling that everything is not quite okay. The rise of awareness of mental health issues is an indication of this. You know, many people are looking for all sorts of solution to a deep, deep unease, a deep, deep dis-ease with themselves. But they don't realise that the solution is to be found in Jesus. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that every mental health problem or anxiety disorder is like this, but I do believe that there is a very good chance that many of the anxieties that people cope with and people fight with are a consequence of having rejected Jesus wholesale. Mr. Right invites Mr. Wrong to live with him. Jesus invites us into relationship with him. He doesn't wait for us to become right before we can have a relationship with him. He invites us to live with him right in the midst of our rubbish and our wrongness. And again, people will often have this kind of antagonism towards Christians by expressing the view that you think you're so much better than I am. And the flip side of that is they will say something like, I'm not good enough to be a Christian. And it reveals a core belief that you have to be good to be accepted by God. That only good people are Christians, and nothing could be further from the truth. And the account of Zacchaeus shows us that Jesus accepts us even when we are wrong. And while our transition from death to life, from being dead to being born again is a decision that we make, we go through a process as we overcome our sinfulness little by little by little. We change from being wrong to being right by living with Jesus and by becoming more like him. Every Christian, I am sure, would agree with me that we're all a work in progress. I remember having a t-shirt when I was younger which had the words on it, be patient, God isn't finished with me yet, on it. And it's important that we understand that becoming a Christian means you've started on a journey, not arrived at a destination. And here are some other things that I believe that we can learn from the account of Zacchaeus. And I'm going to look at them from the verse point of view. So unusually I'm going to go to verse 2 and to verse 3 and to verse 4 and see some of the things that we can learn. So in Luke 19 verse 2 we read that, behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. Zacchaeus is identified as a tax collector. He's not just a sinner, he's a tax collector. And tax collectors were their own category of sinners in that time, and they had their own category of being despised. In the Gospels, we quite often read the phrase "the tax collectors and the sinners," and they're people who were not welcome in society. They were usually Jews. and they were regarded as collaborators and traitors. They worked for the Romans. They took taxes for the Romans. They worked for the occupying force. And what's more, they were usually dishonest. They usually swindled their own people to line their own pockets. And whilst it's not explicitly stated that Zacchaeus was a crook, since he was a tax collector and since he's described as being wealthy, and then you couple that with his statement about paying back people what he has swindled, makes it quite a safe conclusion to draw. Secondly, in verse 3 we read, he was seeking to see Jesus, who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was small in stature. It isn't surprising that Zacchaeus couldn't see Jesus. Yes, he was small. But since others could see Jesus, it is likely that this hatedness on him meant that he was also cold-shouldered by the crowds around him. They wouldn't let him through. They might let other smaller people, like children, through. I mean, this is all supposition, of course. But knowing human nature, I suspect that could well have been what the case was. It's sometimes difficult, if not impossible, to see past people to Jesus. Very often, people around us obscure us from seeing Jesus. And most commonly, it's heard in this rejection of the gospel when people say things like, I don't want to become a Christian, because if becoming a Christian means becoming like those church people that I see out there, that's not the kind of person I want to become. And the bad example of Christians, the bad example of us who are supposed to represent Jesus, we don't actually represent him, we obscure him. The only real way to allow people to see Jesus is to move out the way and to let him see them. And then in verse 4 it says, he ran on ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. You know, Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus. So much so that he ran ahead and he climbed into a tree. Neither running nor climbing were things that Jewish men did. And we tend to think of people who are not Christians as being completely disinterested in the gospel. Some are, but others, well, not so much. I mean, we read in Acts, in the chapter of Acts, in Acts 17, Paul proclaims the gospel in Athens, and we read that some ridiculed him and others said, we will hear more of this. Some people were interested. Not everyone that we meet with is disinterested in the gospel. Now, there's an apologist in America, a man called J. Warner Wallace, who uses the example of a jury and jury selection, and he talks about people to select for a jury, and he says that some people are so set in their opinion of the police that you cannot select them for a jury, because they just think that the police are just so bad, they just will never ever convict because they're so distrusting of the police. And he said that they are the people that if you're prosecuting, you don't want in a jury. They've already made their mind up. He says on the other scale, he says some people trust the police so much they will convict for anything because they trust the police so much. He says the defending people don't want those people on a jury. He says so you select people on the jury, the people in the middle who are open-minded. And what J. Warner Wallace says is when it comes to proclaiming your faith, what you must do is you must try and gauge where someone is at. And if they fall into a category of people who will not accept no matter what you say, they're the very hard people, and the only way to reach them and to make them tender is through prayer. You don't need to waste your time on them. And that what you should do is that you should proclaim the gospel to the people who are at least willing to listen. One key to seeing people respond to the gospel is to proclaim the gospel to the people who are open, rather than the people who wouldn't become Christians even if Christ stood in front of them and poked them in the eye. Verse 5, we read, and when Jesus came to that place, he looked up and he said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry down because I'm going to come to your house for tea. You know, Jesus saw Zacchaeus. The one person who was ignored by all the people in his community was seen by Jesus. Even the most invisible of us is noticed by Jesus. Whatever you've done, however you've lived, you might be being ignored by the world. It may be even because of some past action or because of some attitude, but you need to know this. Jesus sees you. He values you. And he says to you, will you have fellowship with me? He says to you, the people around you may not love you. The people around you may hurt you or tease you or gossip about you, but I notice you. And I say to you, will you have fellowship with me? And Jesus' own words to Zacchaeus saying, come down because I'm going to stay at your house for tea, are almost an echo, a reflection, if you like, of Revelation 3 verse 20, where Jesus says, behold, I stand at the door and knock, and if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him and he with me. Eating has particular significance. Sharing a meal with someone is a very visible way of showing who you value and who you love. And you know, heaven, we sometimes think like heaven is an eternal worship service. Actually, heaven is far more frequently described as an eternal banquet, a wedding feast, a party. And in verse 6 we read, so he hurried down and came down and received him joyfully. You know, Zacchaeus' response to Jesus was very clearly, yes. Pardon me. In fact, he came down at once. There was no hesitation. No, I'm going to go home and think about it. It was a plain and simple, yes, Jesus. Now, I'm by nature a procrastinator, and my motto would be, why do today what you can put off till tomorrow? But Zacchaeus didn't need time. His response was immediate. And later on we read that this decision to act, he didn't mull over it and think about it for a week. He made a decision and acted on it. He stood up and said, I will pay back anyone I've defrauded. It wasn't like, I'm going to think about it and then perhaps I might pay them back. No, it was, I'm going to do it. Verse 7 we read that when they saw it, they all grumbled. He's gone into the guest of a man who's a sinner. And that's something we read fairly regularly in the Gospels, that Jesus didn't really take notice of societal norms. He regularly ministered to that kind of person, whether it was a tax collector or a prostitute or an unclean woman or a leper or a Samaritan. Even in his own death, he was crucified with criminals. And the crowds regularly criticised him for it. When people thought he should know what kind of a person this is, with our hindsight of who he is, we know that he did know what kind of person they were, and yet he chose to be with them. In fact, he's called a glutton and a drunkard for eating and drinking with people. And you may feel out of it. You may feel like you are not that kind of person. You may feel that you're ignored and undervalued by people around you. Jesus' offer applies to you as surely as it did for Zacchaeus on that day. Jesus' offer applies for you as surely as it does for me or every one of the good people you can think about. Jesus says to you, I'm coming to your house for tea. Will you accept me? And then in Luke 19 and verse 8, Zacchaeus stands before the Lord and says, behold, Lord, half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. You know, people are basically selfish. From time to time we come across people who are generous, but even under those circumstances, these people make judgments about who they're going to give their money to. I'm only going to give it to that kind of person, or I'm only going to give it to that kind of person. And they create foundations. The Bill Gates Foundation has got billions of dollars to give away, and they make decisions about who they're going to give it to. Only some people make the cut. Only some people get the money. Not everyone. You have to fill certain criteria. And they make value judgments on other people when they give their money to. And I've personally experienced people saying things like, why do you give them money? They don't need it. You know, we can often see what drives people by looking in two places. In their diary and in their wallet. People will spend both time and money on the things that are important to them. You know, you remember the rich man in Mark 10, for example, we've got the rich man, and it says Jesus was setting out on a journey, and a man ran up and knelt before him and said, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says to him, why are you calling me good? No one is good except God. Do you know what he's saying? He's saying, you're calling me God. You know the commandments. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not defraud. Honour your father and mother. And the man looked at him and said, All of these things I've done from my youth. And Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said to him, you lack one thing. Go and sell everything you have and give the money to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven. And come and follow me. Disheartened by the saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. Jesus says a lot about money. In fact, I've heard it said that Jesus talks more about money than he does about anything else. I don't know if that's true, I've not checked it, but he does say some very sobering things about money. Here are just a few of them. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. He says, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. He says, don't lay up treasure for yourselves on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. He says, use your worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. He says, you cannot serve both God and money. And Paul writes, the love of money is the root of all evils. And he says, through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and have pierced themselves for many pounds. The love of money can draw people away from the faith. In other words, Zacchaeus' response and his offer of recompense towards those he swindles is absolute and convincing evidence of the genuineness of his conversion. Where's the evidence of your faith? Of mine? There was a saying which made the rounds a few years back, which went like this. If you were arrested for being a Christian tomorrow, would there be enough evidence to convict you? And Luke 19 verse 9 says, Jesus said to him, salvation today has come to this house, for he is also a son of Abraham. Do you know, Jesus responds to those that respond to him. Jesus' response in verse 9 reflects that today salvation has come to this house. That's a real echo of the cross. In the midst of all of the pain and the suffering and the hate he was enduring, Jesus could still look at the thief on the cross beside him who confessed him and said, today you will be with me in paradise. When we respond to Jesus, when we respond to the gospel, there is no hesitation on God's part. You do not need to be held back by the I'm not good enough argument. It's codswallop. Respond to God and he will respond to you. James says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. 2 Chronicles 15 verse 2 says, if you seek God, he will be found by you. Zechariah says, thus declares the Lord of hosts, return to me, says the Lord of hosts, and I will return to you, says the Lord of hosts. And Jeremiah 29 verse 11, which is a passage which many people cling to, where God says, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future, goes on into verse 12 through to 14 and says this, then you will call to me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord. You know, when we seek God, when we return to him, when we call out to him, he responds to us. He's just waiting to respond to us. The parable of the prodigal son gives a picture of the father looking for his wayward son coming home. And this father is an image of God. Jesus says the father is God. And do you know what he does? He runs to greet a returning wayward son, and he throws a banquet and feasts his return. That happens for every sinner who repents. Now that is good news. But that's not the end of the story. Now there is an end to the Mr. Man story that I missed out at the beginning. And it is this. Now you probably think that's the end of the story, don't you? Well, it isn't. The reason is, it isn't because of what happened to Mr. Right. The trouble was, you see, the longer Mr. Wrong had stayed with Mr. Right, the more right Mr. Wrong became, but the more wrong Mr. Right had become. Isn't that extraordinary? Oh dear. Mr. Wright sighed. My plan didn't work quite out the way I'd planned after all. And he went to bed. And this is quite possibly the most significant page in the story. Mr. Right becomes wrong, and he takes all the wrongness of Mr. Wrong so that Mr. Wrong can be right. And that's the gospel in a nutshell, isn't it? 2 Corinthians 5 verse 21 says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And that brings a challenge to we who call ourselves Christians. Are we acting like the crowds? Are we obscuring people's view of Jesus? You know, I believe that every one of us has a role in the world to show people what Jesus is like. And by my actions and my words, I am supposed to be a reflection of Jesus so that they can actually see him. I need to be sure that my actions and that my words are not a barrier to people seeing Jesus, but it is a way that they might see him. Now, I've heard people say of Christians, well, if that's what Christians are like, then I don't want to be one. You know, DC Talk, in one of their songs, says the biggest cause of atheism in the world today are Christians. That people can praise God with their lips and then deny him with their actions. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. And to the unbeliever, if you're not a believer this morning, and you're listening to me and thinking, what a stupid idiot this guy is, do you know, I just need to say to you this: it is not good enough for you to blame Christians for your sins. It is not good enough that you will blame churches and Christians for the fact you're not a Christian. Jesus makes an offer to you. Zacchaeus climbed a tree. He didn't let anyone's actions deter him from seeing Jesus. And I would challenge you not to let others' actions deter you from finding and meeting the real Jesus. Don't you listen to hearsay. Hearsay you might have heard at school or on the telly about Christianity, which is usually biased and negative, to say the least. Don't judge what Christianity is like simply by looking at other Christians around you either. Most of us, if we were honest, would describe ourselves as a work in progress. We are at best a flawed reflection of a perfect God. And often not even that. I challenge you to look for the real thing. Investigate the Bible. Go to an Alpha course or similar and seek and find out Jesus for yourself. You can either stay in the tree, and when Jesus calls you and say, come down, that I want to eat with you. You can stay on your high horse and say, I don't believe any of it. Or you can come down and start a relationship with Jesus. Let him show you who he really is. Or you can go to the party and see others responding to Jesus and be judgmental about them and say, well, I don't really know what they're doing. But there is a response you must make. Zacchaeus wasn't saved because he opened his door to Jesus and let him in. Jesus declared salvation not when Zacchaeus opened the door and let him in, but when Zacchaeus stood up and showed that he had changed, that his heart had changed. When we spend time with Jesus, we should change. And for Zacchaeus, the point of change was his money. For you, it might be something different. It could be your tongue, perhaps your gossip or something, or an anger. It could be a temper. The challenge is this, is when Jesus meets us, when we respond to him and we let him change us, we will never be the same again. And salvation really will come into your heart and into my heart when we do that.